For the ancient Greeks and Romans, the Trojan War belonged to their distant past. They dated it, argued about it, and traced their ancestries to its heroes. But by the modern era, many scholars had come to doubt whether the city behind the story had ever really existed. Then, in the 19th century, investigators turned to a mound called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. What they uncovered was not a single city, but a settlement built up in layer upon layer across thousands of years. And that discovery changed the question entirely. No longer simply whether there had been a Troy, but how much of Homer's tradition preserved a real memory, and how much was legend. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the poem, and what it actually contains. The Iliad, composed by the poet we call Homer around the 8th century BCE, is set during the Trojan War, in which a coalition of Greek kingdoms besieges the city of Troy to recover Helen, the wife of a Greek king. But the Iliad does not tell the entire war. It focuses on a brief period in the war's final year, built around the rage of the Greek hero Achilles, and it ends not with the city's fall, but with the funeral of the Trojan prince Hector. The wooden horse, the sack of Troy, its burning, these belong to the wider cycle of Trojan legends and to later ancient texts, not to the Iliad itself. This distinction matters, because much of what people picture as the Trojan War is not actually in the Iliad. And crucially, the poem was composed centuries after the events it describes, passed down through generations of oral tradition before it was ever written down. For the ancient Greeks, the war was part of their heroic past. But from the early modern period onward, scholars increasingly questioned how much real history these poems preserved. That doubt did not mean everyone denied a city at Hisarlik. It meant the historical core of the story was genuinely uncertain. The modern investigation of Troy is bound up with two very different men. The first was Frank Calvert, an English expatriate who had studied the region carefully. Calvert had identified the mound at Hisarlik as the likely site of Troy, and had already excavated parts of it himself. What he lacked was money and publicity. The second man had both in abundance. Heinrich Schliemann was a wealthy, relentlessly self-promoting businessman, convinced that Homer's poems described real places. Calvert generously shared his knowledge and his conclusions with Schliemann, and Schliemann later did his best to minimize Calvert's role in the story. Beginning in 1870, Schliemann drove enormous trenches straight down into the mound. He helped bring international attention and large-scale excavation to Hisarlik, and confirmed that it held a deep, layered past. But his methods were crude and damaging by any standard. In his rush to reach what he assumed was Homer's Troy at the very bottom, he cut straight through the layers that later archaeologists would come to believe actually belonged to the late Bronze Age city. Later archaeologists condemned his approach, even as they built on the site he had opened up. Schliemann did not single-handedly discover Troy, and his dramatic, self-serving published accounts have long required caution. Schliemann also made a famous mistake. Deep in the mound, he uncovered a spectacular hoard of gold, jewelry, and ornaments, which he announced to the world as the treasure of King Priam, Troy's ruler in Homer's poem. The objects were genuine ancient artifacts. But his identification was simply wrong. The hoard belonged to a layer known as Troy II, dating to roughly the 3rd millennium BCE, more than 1,000 years before the conventional Late Bronze Age setting of the Trojan War. A famous photograph of Schliemann's wife wearing the jewels helped build the legend of the discovery, but Schliemann's account of how and where it was found has long been questioned by historians. And this points to the real problem. Hisarlik is not one city but many, built one above another. The traditional sequence runs from Troy I through Troy IX, spanning from around 3600 BCE to the Roman period, and more recent excavation has identified an even earlier phase now called Troy 0. Not every layer is a clean, separate city destroyed and rebuilt in a single event. Some are subdivided, with gradual transitions. So the real question sharpened: which of these layers belong to the Late Bronze Age world that the Trojan tradition remembered? 2 layers became the leading candidates, and here the evidence grows genuinely interesting. Careful later archaeologists, Wilhelm Dorpfeld and then the American Carl Blegen, focused on the upper levels. The first candidate was Troy VI, a large, wealthy, strongly fortified city with impressive sloping stone walls, in regular contact with the Mycenaean Greek world, as fragments of imported pottery clearly show. Troy VI was destroyed in the late 13th century BCE. The tilted walls and displaced masonry led many archaeologists, especially Blegan, to interpret the destruction as an earthquake. But other explanations, including conflict, or a combination of causes, remain debated to this day. The second candidate was the very next layer, Troy VIIa. And this city tells a different story. Archaeologists have pointed to crowded housing built inside the walls, large storage jars sunk into the floors as if for a population bracing for a long emergency, and a violent destruction by fire, with weapons and human remains found in the destruction contexts. These findings make warfare genuinely plausible. But they do not identify who the attackers were, and they do not prove Homer's 10-year war. Troy VIIa was destroyed around 1180 BCE. The most striking evidence, though, comes from outside the Greek world entirely. It comes from the Hittites, who ruled a powerful empire in Bronze Age Anatolia and kept extensive diplomatic records on clay tablets. In those records, they refer repeatedly to a city in the right region called Wilusa. One Hittite treaty was even made with a king of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name that has intrigued scholars for its resemblance to Alexandros, another name for the Trojan prince Paris. Most scholars associate Wilusa with the Greek name Ilios, or Ilion, an older name for the city we call Troy. The Hittite texts also mention a people called the Ahhiyawa, widely associated by scholars with the Mycenaean Greek world, the Achaeans of Homer's own poem. These are mainstream identifications, though not mathematically certain. And the texts describe real friction, diplomatic disputes, rebellions, and military concerns involving Wilusa, with an Aegean power widely linked to the Mycenaean Greeks active in western Anatolia. This is an independent, contemporary Anatolian source. But the Hittites were not a neutral third party, they were themselves deeply involved in the region's politics. Their records show that Wilusa existed in a genuinely contested area, and that Aegean powers were active there. What they do not do is describe the war exactly as later Greek epic tells it. So what does the archaeology actually prove? The careful, honest answer is this. A major Bronze Age city existed at Hisarlik, in the region that later Greek tradition identified with Troy, or Ilion. It suffered multiple destructions, and at least one late Bronze Age layer shows signs that may reflect warfare. Greeks and the peoples of Western Anatolia really were in contact, and at times in conflict, during this age, documented independently in Hittite records. What the archaeology does not prove is Homer's war as the poems tell it. No excavation has found Helen, or Achilles, or a wooden horse. The Iliad is not a documentary. It is poetry, shaped by roughly 4 centuries of oral retelling, layering gods, heroes, and exaggeration on top of whatever real memory lay beneath. And the ground still speaks. In 2025, excavators reported a concentration of clay and riverstone projectiles near a Troy VI palace area. Their location may point to defensive or offensive activity, but the precise date, context, and meaning remain under study. It is a preliminary field finding, not proof of the Trojan War, not yet tied to any single destruction, and it does not tell us who, if anyone, was fighting whom. Troy is the rare case where a myth led us to something real. A poem about gods and heroes turned out to be anchored, however loosely, to an actual hill, an actual city, and an actual age of conflict. The wooden horse may never have existed. The heroes may belong to poetry. But the walls were real, the destructions were real, and the world that preserved their memory was real. What Homer preserved was not a record of events, but the long echo of them, carried across centuries until someone at last went looking for the city beneath the song. The poem was legend. The city beneath it was not. Subscribe if you want to keep following the questions that don't have clean answers. See you in the dark.